dwell too much on one thing. On to the idea of a just transition and a transition for the workers, because I'm sure, we all know that Shannon Airport is not in a great state financially. So many of the routes now go through Dublin. And oftentimes when you talk about the military use of Shannon, that's what comes up, the workers. And I was just wondering, would you talk a little bit about that, Lynn, and how, you could how we'll have to factor in workers like that to a just transition?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a red herring that Shannon Airport is dependent on the US troops going through it. And I think one of the things that Sinn Féin has called for is that Shannon Airport will be brought back into the National Airport Authority, and you'd have more regional balance. So rather than Dublin Airport competing for the flights and then people from the Midwest and Limerick driving to Dublin to catch a flight, that you would be able to have a more regional balance to it. But I think it was a question from Maurice Quinlivan this year when he met with the Shannon Airport Authority, or Paul Gavin, but they met with him anyway because it's in crisis about being under pressure, and they were told that the US troops is only worth about €2 million per year to Shannon Airport, so it's actually quite a small amount of money that's incoming from allowing the use of the airport by the US Army. And if you were to then take away what it costs in terms of the security resources and all of that, that is probably a much smaller amount again. So I think if you wanted to have a just transition for the airport workers, a more regional approach to transport and the airport would be far better. And I think for a lot of the workers, they'd much prefer that than having troops coming through on a daily basis.
And having to hope that war goes on forever to keep your job.
Yeah.
Because and I've often wondered, how much would, do the workers in Shannon believe that, which is often thrown out, by, I suppose, by different parties, but saying, oh, you have to do that or you're anti-jobs, you have to let the US land or you're anti-jobs.
They'll probably blame Brexit on it now. Brexit is being blamed on everything at the moment. So it's can't do anything. It's Brexit. No, and I think part of it is, okay, the workers in Shannon will see the troops on a regular basis, but that's sort of going back to what I was saying at the start. The fact that it's not covered on a very, very regular basis, I think most people aren't aware, do you know what I mean, of the level of flights that are coming through, and those pictures when they do sometimes get into the newspapers of soldiers sitting around Shannon Airport. So I do think there's kind of a blind side, some of us who are involved in it or are following it or have an interest in it. But I think for the vast majority of the public, it's not in their mind, and they're probably not even aware that this is still happening, that this was something that happened with Iraq. And, kind of go, are we still allowing that to go on? And that's where I suppose maybe we'll get to that later about just, what is the strategy of how do you, and likes of events like this, to try and raise awareness among the general population and a whole new generation of people, to sort of make them aware of what's going on, but also to kind of start that conversation about, are we happy that that's going on?
Yeah. And actually, I'm just seeing questions there. Please throw your questions in as soon as you think of them, because I always think of questions and I forget. Just pop them in. I forgot to say that 40 minutes ago. Sorry about that. But on that, I suppose, taking it to today, where do we stand with our government? I know Catherine Connolly put in parliamentary questions a few weeks ago, maybe, and where does our government stand with it? Because it's not often in the news, and the public pressure, the massive public pressure isn't there. So what is our stance? Do you think anything will change with the new administration coming in?
With the new American administration, or
or do you with the new American administration, with our new government?
I actually think it lessens the chance of action being taken because there's a new US administration, because for some reason the Democrats are just viewed as being wonderful and Donald Trump, and I'm sure there's rightly so, a lot of people in America particularly who are breathing a sigh of relief at the thought of Trump being out of office, and especially people of color. But I just think that, even the fact when it was Hillary Clinton, I mean, these are people who have been heavily involved in that sort of war complex, military industrial complex. So I think it's probably going to make it harder for us to challenge the US administration. And when I was joking earlier about Brexit, there will be that element of, President Biden is a friend to Ireland. He's going to protect, the Good Friday Agreement. So we can't rock the boat on the fact that troops are coming in. So for me, that's the sort of the downside of that, is I do actually think it'll make it harder politically to challenge. That's not to say that we give up. We absolutely have to keep it on. And I mean, in the UN Security Council seat is something like, I was reading through, what we stood on, which was a peace and empathy and independence. So if we are independent, then we should actually be using that independence to say, look, we respect that America is a good friend to Ireland on lots of issues, but we don't agree with you on your foreign policy, and therefore we can't facilitate or no longer be complicit in that foreign policy by allowing you to use the airport.
I was laughing reading through Catherine Connolly's and Simon Coveney's back and forth there in November. I think it was November. Because he was saying, oh yes, because peace and friendliness and peacekeeping and all this, and she was saying, yeah, but it's not very peaceful to let an active military force through your airport. And he was like, that was basically the exchange. And she's like, oh, I don't know. They're like the biggest army ever.
Yeah.
I mean, peace. Yeah, that's all. Like it just kept coming back to this. It was like, okay, right.
I mean,
but I suppose it'll be him in the UN security.
Yeah, I mean, well, and you have the ambassador who takes sort of the role, the sort of the day job, so to speak. But like in that exchange that she had, I mean, the figures she was quoting around the displacement are horrific. Like it was 79.5 million people have been displaced in 2019, but 39 million of them are a direct result of US wars since 2001. So like this is the irony as well. So you have people who object to refugees and to taking in migrants, but at the same time don't have a problem with us facilitating the displacement of people and causing that problem in the first place by allowing the US to use Shannon. So I mean, like those figures are horrific. Like to think that 39 million people have been displaced, and Ireland has played a part in that through the use of Shannon.
Yeah. And I'll ask you both to speculate, and I understand if you don't want to, but as to why our successive governments have been so ready to allow the US military use Shannon. Like, what's in it for them, Why would they, like, there's no pressure coming from their constituents to say, we want the US military in Shannon. So where does that commitment to it come from? Either you there.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to know what happened at the time when the deal essentially was made back in 2002 to allow them to start using Shannon. What sort of quid pro quos were expected there when Bertie Ahern was in government? And the wool was pulled over the doll's eyes largely on that. They were sort of walked into what was called a temporary arrangement, and successive governments have held on to that since. I would imagine that some governments since then, particularly Fine Gael-led governments, would probably have us knee deep in NATO right now if they could have gotten away with it. So to some extent, the opposition to our complicity in war has, to some extent, I suppose, been successful in that we're not entirely embedded. But it was interesting, back in 2008, there was a report that appeared in RTE to say that the US military had actually offered to stop using Shannon. But the government at the time said, no, it's okay, you can keep using it. You can stay there. And we've always heard this narrative that, it would jeopardize the economic benefit to the area of having foreign direct investment and so on from the US. But that argument rang very hollow when Dell Computers, one of the largest multinationals in our area, just moved their manufacturing operation lock, stock and barrel from Limerick over to Poland, making a couple of thousand people redundant, out of work. You know, Michael Dell didn't make his decisions on the basis of the US military use of Shannon. He made it on other grounds. So they're holding on to it. I mean, it probably serves US interests to have another country who may not be in NATO, but is like a first cousin of NATO, aligned with them in their coalition of the willing, or whatever they call it these days. But and our Irish governments have probably always been afraid to say no. They've always been afraid, or too cowardly perhaps, to do the honourable and the right thing and ensure we're not complicit in so much death and destruction and displacement of people.
Any thoughts, Lynn, as to why?
No, I was just reading one of the questions there, and someone was saying, it's not a matter of if we agree with the US policy or not, and they're right. I mean, it is a matter of Ireland's neutrality and our human rights responsibilities. And I was reading an article about the fact that Ireland has signed up, I think it's the International Criminal Court, and that if there was a possibility that Iraq was to become a co-signee, that it would leave Ireland open to being prosecuted for its role in the drone attack on the Baghdad airport that killed Soleimani. Do you mean, so it's a hypothetical, but yeah, I mean, the person who put that question is absolutely right. Like, we should be doing it for human rights reasons and to protect our neutrality, as well as the fact that we might not agree with foreign policy.
Yeah, but like, obviously, you know, I've had interactions on Twitter, which I know is not real life, but people will say, well, if we didn't have the US, we'll be all run by Russia, or we'd be all run. One person was telling me how we'd be all run by Iran, and I'm like your prediction skills, like, these are not just simple. If the US was out of Shannon, like, I don't know what alternative course of history he went on, but like that, it just rings so hollow.